As the name suggests, a 7-segment display consists of 7 individual segments, which together can be used to display any number from 0 to 9. In order to shift from one number to the next without the use of any electronics, we need what's called a programming wheel. On this wheel, we can put in pins corresponding to each of the segments that need to be toggled on for each number, and then as we turn the wheel, the display counts up through each of those numbers. Now, this design is already pretty compact in its own right, but I knew it would be possible to make a 7-segment display far more compact than this, and I really wanted to see just how small I could make one. While the size of this display and all of its mechanism doesn't matter too much when I'm just showing a single number, if I wanted to use it to display numbers in the double or triple digits, it would start taking up my whole table. The first step would be to make the design more slender by fitting the whole programming wheel directly behind the display, so that we could fit the numbers directly next to one another. But even that way, the assembly would still be huge with multiple digits. The biggest factor here is the width of the module, so the narrower I can make it, the better, and ideally it shouldn't be too tall either. Well, what about this? 6 studs wide, and about 15 tall. So how exactly does this display work? Well, it doesn't yet. That's why I've got to spend the rest of the video working on. But for all the mechanism I end up building back here, I'm not too concerned about it extending quite far back, but it's crucial that all of it, including the programming wheel, can fit directly behind the display, within this footprint. If anything at all sticks out on either side, it would stop me from fitting these displays seamlessly next to one another. Okay, so first off, how did I make this display and all of its segments so tiny? Well, on that larger design I showed, each segment used a small assembly like this to flip between showing an orange surface or a black surface. Most displays I've seen other creators make online also use this method, and they work to great effect when they're done at a relatively large scale, but when I tried shrinking the segments down to just 2 studs wide, there simply wasn't enough space to fit them all next to each other. I did see a really clever design that used axles moving in and out of view to show the different numbers, and while it is very compact, for a purely mechanical display like the one I'm building, there's just a certain charm to using flipping segments that I wanted to try to maintain if I could. Ultimately, at this small of a scale, I settled on using these coloured card strips stuck onto rotating links like this, and with tiles covering up the rest of the area, I'd say they make for a pretty convincing display. Even this way, it was quite a challenge to ensure that each of the 7 segments could rotate independently, and could each be powered from behind. These lower 3 segments were fairly simple to make, and they can all rotate freely, but then to attach on the middle segment, those housing pieces have to just sit freely within the slots of the 2 segments below. And then I just mirrored the same design for the top half. However, since all these vertical segments are being used to house these connectors above and below, the only way to flip them on and off was from these axles sticking out from their sides. And for those, I couldn't even place a lift arm here because it won't fit round the corner of this connector when I tried to pull it back. So I had to put the lift arm all the way down here to flip the segments, and I'll need to do the same for the other 3 vertical segments when I get to those. After trying out a few different options for the horizontal segments, I settled on this design, which just left one more challenge to solve. As well as covering up the outside edges of the display with some tiles, I knew that I would also need to cover up these spaces between the segments. The only issue is, out of this 2x2 area that needs to be covered, this is the only stud of space that never gets obstructed by any of the moving linkages. So I had to fit an open stud out to the front through that tiny bit of space to give at least one point of connection for the tile. I repeated the same design for the lower half, and finally that was the front end of the display all worked out, which just left the programming wheel round the back. On the larger design, I used these track links to create the 10 evenly spaced modules corresponding to each of the 10 numbers, but when I tried scaling this down, I was really surprised by just how few options there were. There were a ton of pieces with 6 axes of symmetry and 8, but pretty much nothing for 10. So I again relied on some track link pieces, but smaller ones this time. Quite conveniently, you can fit exactly 10 of these tracks around a 20-tooth gear like this, and all these small holes seemed like they'd work perfectly for attaching on all the pins. Well, for the middle row, yes. For these holes directly above and below, these holes are blocked off by the track underneath, so no pins would stay in there. But these outer holes should work, right? Well, to my surprise, no! There's just a tiny sliver of these upper reinforcements that stick out into the path of the pin, and they stop it from going in properly. I get that these thicker sections are here to strengthen the track, but couldn't they be just a little thinner? Like, why make this hole the perfect diameter for all LEGO bar elements, and then just block it off? Normally with Lego, every feature of every piece is the size and shape it is for a particular reason. It's one of the things I love about it. But using these tracks with these small teeth as pins really was the only solution I found that was small enough to fit within the width of the display. So I knew I had to find a way to fit all the pins in it. It was very tempting to just force the pieces through and call it a day, but it really just felt like admitting defeat unless I at least tried some other options. And believe me, I tried. I tested out almost every random piece and minifig accessory you could think of, and almost nothing would stay in place with the slightly narrower holds. The best options I found were these ice skate pieces, which stayed in place but didn't stick out far enough, and these root pieces, which I could kind of finesse into the right position, but I wouldn't be able to fit 9 or 10 of them in here for all of the pins. So finally, yeah, I caved in, and I decided to just force the pieces through. In my defense, I'd call this maybe bending the rules a bit, but not quite breaking them. And as for it damaging these track pieces a little, if you remember this video, you'll know that I've got quite a few of these tracks to spare. So with all that said, here it is. Actually, I thought I'd mention quickly that I know all these pins being white makes them a bit hard to see against the background, which is why I wouldn't normally build anything in white, but all these small tooth pieces are typically used for, well, teeth, so I had quite a few of them in white. I also had quite a few spares from when I was building some snowy trees a few years ago, where I used a bunch of them for these small icicles. But anyway, let's see how the full programming wheel will work. You can see that I've linked up the bottom segment to this arm down here. So with the programming wheel in place, the bottom row of pins can push on the arm to flip that segment for each number where that bottom segment has to be active. The next step was to make arms like that for each of the other 6 segments. And there you have it, I managed to fit in all of the arms. I'd like to point out that a lot of the segments don't flip a full 90 degrees, but only end up moving by about 45 or 60 degrees. For the horizontal segments, it's just because of where I was able to fit in their linkages, so the arms can't pull the segments back quite far enough. It just means that those segments aren't quite fully hidden when they get switched off, but with the tiled on, it's not that noticeable, and they still get covered up pretty well. For the vertical ones, I actually had to add in stoppers to prevent the segments from moving all the way back, because otherwise they'd get stuck in that back position, as you can see if I remove the stopper. The final step here was to add a proper return mechanism for the segments, so that they return to their default positions after the pins have pushed them. On the big display, I just relied on gravity to let the segments fall back down once the pins have moved past. And while that solution worked out pretty well here, it's got quite a few issues, the biggest one being that it only works if the display is pointing straight upwards. You can see that if I change its orientation, the segments don't return to their off positions anymore. So it wouldn't even be possible to rely on gravity for these vertical segments. I did think that the horizontal segments might have enough weight to fall back down on their own, and they do some of the time, but it just wasn't reliable. Even on the larger display, most of the segments weren't heavy enough to push back all of their linkages on their own, so I had to attach these extra weight blocks to most of them to make sure they'd have enough weight to fall back down consistently. For the vertical segments, I had some ideas to use rubber pieces like this behind the beams, but they didn't push the segments back all the way and offered much more resistance than I wanted. Instead, I decided to make essentially a wall of rubber bands that press against all of the arms. You can see that all 7 of the segments will now stay in their off positions by default. And you know, I think this looks really cool. The benefit of using just 2 rubber bands to cover all 7 arms is that the bands get stretched a similar amount if just one arm is pushed or several of them, so the resistance doesn't accumulate like it would if each segment had its own rubber band. And this actually made me notice another improvement I could make. See, so far I've been using the pins to flip the segments on to show the orange bars, and by default they're off. But looking at the pin configurations needed for each number, I realised that out of the spots that can have pins, there are way more spots with pins than without. So if I instead make the segments on by default, and that the pins pushing each segment turns them off, then we can use far fewer pins on the programming wheel. So on average, there'll be a lot fewer pins pushing on the arms, meaning the rubber bands will get stretched less, and there'll be less resistance when turning the programming wheel. Just look at how many fewer pins we're using now. I then ran into one last quick issue. For some numbers, the programming wheel has to push back these 2 arms without pushing the one between them, but since the rubber band gets stretched out of the way, there's nothing to stop that middle arm from moving too. There were only 2 segments where this was an issue, so I gave both of those segments extra rubber bands to hold them in place. I know it adds more resistance, but I really didn't see another option. And now for the moment of truth, as I turn the programming wheel, the display successfully shows each number from 0 through to 9. The one final touch this display needed was a way to hold on each number, as right now when I let go of the wheel, all the segments flip back to their default positions. First off, I put the programming wheel through a 2.5 to 1 gear reduction, so that turning this axle by 90 degrees turns the wheel exactly from one number to the next. My plan with this was then to drive this axle with a 90-degree stepper mechanism, which essentially locks the axle in 90-degree intervals. Something about that approach just seemed a bit inefficient though, since turning the programming wheel to the next number already needs some force to push past the rubber bands, and the stepper would just be adding on even more resistance when I first tried to turn the axle. Since the segments and the rubber bands are already applying an opposing force to the programming wheel, I realised that I could just add a simple ratchet to that wheel to lock it in place for each number. You can kind of think of it like the wheel is being stuck between a rock and a hard place, or to be more specific, between a ratchet and a rubber band. Getting this ratchet mechanism to also fit within the outline of the display also led to a few headaches, mainly because I needed the programming wheel to lock just when it's pushing all of these arms back the furthest, but no more, since that will jump it to the next number. Long story short, a ratchet that was 6 LEGO units in length was too long, but when I brought it down to 5 units, it was too short. But I managed to find a happy medium, and somehow I fitted it in alongside all the other mechanisms. And there you have it. The display works fairly well, and it all fits within the 6 stud wide footprint. My one critique with it is I would have liked to make the orange bars on the segments a bit thicker, but when I tried doing that, they ended up still being partially visible when the segments were switched off. Seeing that we can fit these displays directly next to each other, there is one job that's left to do, which would be to add a mechanism that shifts the next digit up by 1 when this display reaches 9 and shifts back round to 0. You'll have to forgive the colours on this display, as I didn't have all the pieces in the right colours to make a second one of these, and this was just my testing version. If I did want to make more of these displays and link them all up to each other, I'll need to order some more pieces first, so maybe I'll save all that for another video, if you'd be interested in seeing it. But that's about it for this one, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.